But first, the North American stock markets are clearly shaken by Donald Trump's latest trade decision. Let's take a quick look at the Dow here. You can see right there, that's when Donald Trump made the announcement to slap tariffs on China. The Dow now closed down 722 points. Session lows were even lower than that, 3% drop on the day. Trump has long claimed that there's an unfair advantage that China has. And the concern here is that a move like this could clearly set off a trade war between the world's two largest economies. I want to bring in my colleague, the CBC's Ellen Morrow, who joins us from Washington with details on this. Ellen, how concrete is this plan?
Well, this is the first step, Peter, of hitting China with the $60 billion in tariffs. Basically, the announcement today kicks off a process. The U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer now has 15 days to come up with a list of specific products to be targeted. That list could end up including some 1,300 items. Then after that list is created, there's a period of consultation for 30 days before the final list is created. So we're about 45 days away from knowing the full details of what's going to happen. But again, a big number, $60 billion. And President Trump said that's necessary given the trade deficit between the two countries. Here's a bit of what he had to say on that.
We have a trade deficit, depending on the way you calculate, of $504 billion. Now, some people would say it's really $375 billion. Many different ways of looking at it, but any way you look at it, it is the largest deficit of any country in the history of our world. It's out of control.
So clearly this announcement today is part of President Trump's America First agenda. And as we know, it's the second major tariff announcement from the Trump administration in about as many weeks after the White House earlier this month outlined those sweeping tariffs on steel and aluminum, tariffs from which Canada will be exempt. And we're now learning that other U.S. allies, like countries in the European Union, will also be exempt. So those tariffs not as sweeping as initially thought. And from today's announcement, it's clear the U.S. sees China as the biggest culprit when it comes to unfair trade.
Now, as I was pointing off the top, markets are clearly concerned about this. One of the big concerns is that this will set off something of a trade war. What are you hearing about the potential impact?
Well, there's a lot of fears about that for sure, Peter, because China has already responded to this announcement, promising retaliation of its own in response to these tariffs. So that does set the stage for a trade war. And that's a concern, obviously, for exporters here about any retaliatory tariffs from the Chinese. But we'll remember, going back to the steel and aluminum announcement, President Trump at that time said trade wars can be a good thing. So he doesn't seem too worried about this issue, but it's important to point out that when he made this announcement at the beginning, before he talked about the trade deficit or the tariffs themselves, he said that he sees China as a friend and he has great respect for the Chinese president. And that's because beyond this trade deficit issue, China is an important partner for the United States, especially when it comes to dealing with the situation in North Korea.
No doubt. A complicated tangle. Ellen, thanks for doing this. The CBC's Ellen Morrow in Washington. Now, to look deeper into the impact of America's Chinese tariffs, we have Wenrang Jiang, Senior Fellow at the University of British Columbia's Institute of Asian Research. He's in Calgary today. And from Beijing, we have Erland Eck, Trade Research Manager at the consultancy China Policy. And Erland, you're on the ground there. It's the middle of the night. Thank you very much for getting up so early. When you see an announcement like this, what do you think the official Chinese reaction is going to be?
I think they will be, well, I think they're prepared well for this. So they've done investigations into how to retaliate, and I think they will be, they will separate this from other measures that Trump is also taking in his agenda against globalization. That is what is concerning them, not only this tariff on certain goods.
Wenrang, should we expect to see some kind of an actual trade war, or are we at a stage now when things can still sort of get themselves under control?
I think the trade war danger is definitely there. The Chinese, here now, very calm, no belly course blasting or denunciations, just saying they don't want a trade war, but they're ready for one if they're being forced to do one. And so we got some time, 15 days. We don't know what the punitive tariff goods list is. And then we don't know how, even they have a list 15 days from now, what it will look like and whether they can negotiate within a month after that to have some kind of compromise. But at this point, things don't look good. And other than the Trump wonderland of the small circles around himself today, the rest of the world has this conclusion, this is totally wrong. And I think the whole situation doesn't look good, and the stock market told the story today.
Right. Erlen, I mean, if you listen to the American argument here, it's that Chinese companies have been just ripping off American innovation for years and ripping it off and rebuilding it in China. We do know that there is some problem with IP theft and IP control in China. How serious an issue is that? And how likely is it that China could and would do something about it, especially now that we're in a situation where they have tariffs coming at them potentially?
So I think we are in a crossroad in China. I think China is the factory of the world. They have had competitive advantages in cheap labor and low standards, and that is changing now. And China now wants to import more. So it's an interesting time where you see the U.S. as a global leader attack an up-and-coming leader. I think this issue is about competition for the same sectors, which is higher up in the value chain, where China didn't compete before. Now, China has a different competitive advantage, and that is their own market. So if U.S. companies want to access the Chinese market, they need to follow Chinese rules. And that is what this issue is about, not American rules.
Wenren Zhang, I see you nodding along as Erlen talks about that. It is at least the notion that there is theft of IP and that needs to be dealt with. Is that a fair or legitimate starting point for this conversation?
No, actually, President Trump, in his favorite way, is again playing loose with the numbers. He's saying there's as much as over $500 billion of trade deficit with China. And then he said, depending on how you calculate, or it could be $375 billion. That is a huge gap. The U.S. Trade Representative Office, which he gave authorization to do this punitive tariff on their own official website to say last year's trade deficit with China was $375 billion. And according to independent assessment, that number is an exaggerated one. The real one probably in the range of $150 billion, simply because many of the calculations are wrong. One study showed in 2016, iPhone 6, all produced in China, exported to the United States, counted for $17 billion of Chinese surplus with U.S., but most of those iPhones are coming from everywhere else, and the Chinese gaining on each iPhone assembly is about less than $10. So these are very misleading numbers, but he goes ahead anyway. Not only China, everybody else is taking advantage of the United States, and he's not going through with logic or rationality, just blasting now.
Right. We're looking on a split screen here to have shown that was the TSX numbers, the Canadian Stock Exchange numbers we were looking at. They were down 275 on the day. The Dow Jones, of course, was down 724 points on a particularly nasty week. We saw as soon as President Trump started tweeting about the potential for tariffs, an announcement coming later in the week was back on Monday. We saw the Dow drop off, and then that big drop again on the day, down 2.93%. So let's try to game this forward then. Erlen, where do you see the next step in this? Where should be watching for out of Beijing in terms of a response, in terms of where this story goes from here?
Well, I think the Apple CEO Cook is coming to China actually this morning or today. And I think the how the multinationals will react to this will be something to watch. Like John was talking about, China is in the middle of the global supply chains. They are not necessarily creating value. They haven't done that, and they're trying to change, increasing standards and adding value. Nationals have seen China as a factory. The question is how the multinationals will see China in the future, and China hope they will see China as the market. And if they see China as the targeted market, well, then they can change some global rules. And I think that is what we are seeing. But how this will play out, we've got to see the players.
Right. I'm going to leave it there. I want to thank you both, especially you, Erland, for getting up at, I think it's 4 o'clock in the morning in Beijing. Wenran Jiang is Senior Fellow at the Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. Erland Eck is a Trade Research Manager at China Policy in Beijing.